Before we start today, I do just want to give everybody a sensitive content warning. We are in the middle of a series of episodes discussing the early history of New Orleans, and we will be discussing violence, racial violence, hate speech, segregation, sexual violence, prostitution, and racial language. So this is not an episode for children, but this is an important episode. It's an important period of time in American history, and especially in New Orleans history. We're not going to glorify or linger on any one of these topics, but neither are we going to shy away from them. So I do just want to put it out there that this is not an episode for children, but this is an important episode. And if you're going to listen in, I hope you enjoy the show. And let's get to the content now. Hello, everybody. I'm Jeremy Agnew, host of the Grimdark History podcast, where we explore the intersection between history and popular fiction. If this is your first time tuning in, what we do on this show is dive into the real history that popular fiction pulls into its own lore. For Season 2, what we are exploring is the real history of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicle characters. So we have started with Louis de Pontelac and the recent AMC TV series Interview with the Vampire, which sets itself in early 1900 New Orleans and the era of Storyville and the birth of jazz. So we are exploring the real history of Storyville, of New Orleans in the early 1900s, and the birth of jazz, and all the insanity that was happening that the Louis de Pontelac of the AMC TV series would have experienced and lived through. If you haven't listened yet, you might want to go back to episode 1 in this series, and that is where we discussed the history of New Orleans that Louis would have grown up in. You know, what did it start as? What was the New Orleans of the 1880s like? And the recent changes to the government, the bringing in of the YMDA, the Young Men's Democratic Association, and how their growing Protestant temperance movement values and the, Southern white segregationist movement was moving in to Louisiana and becoming entrenched and having political power to assert its political views on the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana. We also talked about the assassination of Police Chief David Hennessey and how that shocked that white elite part of the city. What were the triggers for that? And we also talked about David Hennessey's best friend, a man by the name of Thomas C. Anderson. And we talked about him because Thomas C. Anderson is an important but peripheral character in the AMC TV series. But Thomas C. Anderson is an actual legitimate historical figure, and he is central to the story of New Orleans in the early 1900s. And so we wanted to talk about David Hennessey and how him and Tom Anderson are related to each other in the last episode. And in this episode, we're going to continue the story of Thomas Anderson of New Orleans. We're going to find out what was the city's response to the assassination of Police Chief David Hennessey, how that happened, what was the fallout for that. And then we're going to talk more about Thomas Anderson, and we're also going to talk about Storyville and how that formed out of all of this, and as well how jazz forms in response to everything that is happening around them. So let's dive in to episode 2 in our series of the history of New Orleans and find out what was the response to the assassination of David Hennessey. How are those two things related? And how does jazz come about as a response to all of this? With the assassination of David Hennessey in October of 1890 blamed on both the Matranga and Provenzano Italian family feud over the dockworker contracts that I talked about in my previous episode, all of New Orleans' white classes were up in arms. The mayor authorizing any and all means to scour the Italian neighborhoods. The police followed the orders with gusto, leading to little to no cause to search homes and arrest Italians regardless of alibi. A dragnet descended on the Italian quarter of the city as makeshift memorials to the Chief of Police started springing up all over the business neighborhood, and public outrage seemed to build in a feedback loop. I can only imagine what it must have felt like for a poor Italian family stuck in the Italian neighborhood as armed crowds of police officers and YMDA militiamen busted in doors looking for any reason or excuse to rough up and arrest people. By Saturday, and that's the day after Hennessey's funeral, the mayor gave an address to a packed session of City Hall and had announced that over 40 Italians had been arrested so far, and that 4 of the 5 supposed gunmen had been detained, and they were closing in on the 5th. This is less than 5 days after the assassination of Hennessey. The mayor reported that in the intervening days that he himself had received several death threats, and according to the mayor's public statements in that City Hall session, quoting the mayor now, "It is clear to me that the wretches who committed this foul deed are the mere hirelings and instruments of others higher and more powerful than they. These instigators are the men we must find at any cost. The people look to you to take the initiative in this matter. Act promptly, without fear or favor." End quote. This is the mayor, of course, addressing the local aldermen, the chief of police, and any public that were in the City Hall meeting. A call to action, not only just to find the people responsible for the murder, but an insistence that there is some insidious, evil Italian organization, dark and powerful, running everything, and that they must all be rooted out, must take the initiative. That very same day, during that same city council meeting, the New Orleans Council elected what they called a Committee of 50 to devise the most effectual and speedy measures for uprooting and the total annihilation of these hellborn associations, as they would put it. They're referring to these mysterious, evil Italian people running the dark criminal underbelly of New Orleans. According to the mayor, and quoting the mayor again, "We owe it to ourselves and to everything that we hold sacred in this life to see that this blow is the last. We must teach these people a lesson that they will not forget for all time, end quote. We can see from this that there is no doubt in the minds of the city council, in the minds of the mayor, who is responsible and what must be done. It's Italians, the evil, mysterious Italians are the problem. And the blow must be the last blow. It must be a final, definitive blow. Something that will teach a lesson that they will not forget for all time. The resulting retribution of the city took 5 more months to unfold, with multiple late-night raids, wild public accusations of citizens against citizens, and a dragnet of arrests of Italians of all stripes. Fine, upstanding, business-class Italians to the lowest, poorest Italian who couldn't speak a word of English, and even Italian nationals that weren't even U.S. citizens that were just visiting the city were caught up in the dragnet. I can't imagine. Times I like to try and imagine it myself. What would it have felt like? What would it have been like? The fear, the internal stress you would have as an Italian, or maybe even just somebody who's not Italian at all, but just happened to live in the Italian quarter because that was the only place you could afford. Knowing that just being associated with the Italian area of the city was enough to potentially see you get jumped in the street, arrested, beat up, somebody bust into your house in the middle of the night, waking up yourself, your family, your children, and dragging you away to a police station to answer a bunch of questions. Where were you 5 months ago? What proof do you have that you were there? That type of thing. I can't even imagine the fear that would instill in me to experience that type of thing. But it was 5 months of that experience for everybody who lived in the Italian quarter of the city. The Committee of 50 was led by a representative of the Young Men's Democratic Association. And if you're wondering who the YMDA are, we talked about them in the last episode. But the Committee of 50, who was leading the police prosecution of this, encouraged extraordinarily heavy-handed action. And it had resulted in the arrest of more than 100 Italians, of which the vast majority were released for lack of evidence. After the more than 100 arrests have been sorted out and filtered, 19 people were put on trial. 9 were accused in direct involvement in the shooting, with others being accessories to the fact. Few people, and few of the whites within the city, believe that only 19 Italians could be responsible for as vast a criminal conspiracy as the mayor was painting a picture of. I remember in my last episode I talked quite at length with multiple examples of the racial hatred New Orleans had of its Italian population, the belief that they were somehow responsible for bars, for black dance halls, for corrupting the soul of the city. Italians were seen as completely evil. And this only reinforced them of that fact and simultaneously gave them an excuse to vent out that fear of that. The 19 defendants were split into 2 groups and 2 separate trials, with more than 140 witnesses being called. I can only imagine the challenge of trying to find jurors without prejudice, given the fervor, the panic, the fear that grabbed the entirety of the city, and with so much contradictory evidence of dubious reliability being provided by both the prosecution and the defense. Rumors swirled of jurors being bribed or threatened to vote one way or the other. The judge certainly couldn't hope for any sane or clean proceedings, and yet that was the expectation as far as the crowd was concerned that was gathering outside the courthouse on the day the verdict was delivered for the very first case or trial. There was only one proper verdict expected to be delivered, and of course that was the expectation of a guilty verdict. At 2:30 p.m., after more than 16 hours of deliberation, the jurors were brought into a courtroom that had been cleared of all except for the judge, the jury, the defense and prosecution, and of course the defendants. Of the 9 accused in the trial in this hearing, 3 were declared a mistrial, and the remaining 6 were declared not guilty. The judge himself, before reading out the verdict, paused for over a minute when he was reading the verdict ahead of time. The defendants were all returned to a local jail pending trial on several lesser charges, but you can only imagine how well this went over to the crowd outside and to the press. There was already violence starting to outbreak as the police tried to get the defendants through the angry crowd, while the press loudly exclaimed the shock to the crowd. The press, in hastily printed articles later that day and for the next several days, called for only one possible solution to this corruption of justice. One of the papers, called the Daily States, called, quoting the paper, "Rise, people of New Orleans." The Young Men's Democratic Association's militia branch took it upon themselves to correct what they thought was a miscarriage of justice. And they had, by that very same evening the verdict was delivered, 60 signatures for a call to action, which they then hastily had printed in next morning's news, inviting, quoting the YMDA's call to action, all good citizens to attend a meeting at Clay Statue to take steps to remedy the failure of justice in the Hennessy case, and to come prepared for action, end quote. The YMDA had brought over 150 loaded Winchester rifles in carts to the call to action meeting the next day, ready to be handed out to any who arrived. The mayor was conspicuously absent from New Orleans that day, avoiding concerned police, avoiding concerned aldermen and local government, or really any representatives from the Italian Quarter or any other concerned citizens who were worried about hundreds of people gathering with over 100 loaded rifles ready to march on the prison. By 10 o'clock, the militia had grown to several hundred, and after handing out all the rifles, began a march through the city, winding its way towards the jail where the Italians were held. The warden of the prison and a handful of police with him attempted to board the doors and windows against the YMDA militia. And one police officer who was standing outside by the gates, when confronted by the 1,000-large mob, armed, shoved back one of the YMDA leaders and immediately had a pistol pointed to his head. That police officer held up his hands and backed away. The militia quickly broke through the doors and windows of the prison, getting access through a side door that wasn't as securely boarded up. And after gaining access to the building, they picked a handful of executioners who were determined gunmen from the YMDA militia to enter the prison. They opened fire indiscriminately into the crowds of prisoners whenever they saw one of the Italian defendants. Those who were not killed in the immediate exchange of fire were dragged outside, strung up, and hanged. For 5 hours, thousands of the citizens of New Orleans, men, women, and yes, even children, reportedly strolled by the prison to see the bodies that had been arranged on display, both inside and outside the prison, with several of the citizens reportedly collecting gruesome souvenirs from the bodies. Many of the jurors were terrorized and ostracized from the city. There were arson attempts made on their homes. Some of them were threatened with violence. Others were just fired from their jobs. Several of them had to leave the city, and some of them moved from the state entirely, moving as far away as Cincinnati, and still received letters by death threats by letter. As for the YMDA militia and those who were involved in the lynching, a grand jury chose to indict exactly no one for 11 murders committed during that lynching. The news of the lynching had spread to the entirety of the USA, with a young Theodore Roosevelt, who was then a civil service commissioner in Washington, called it, quoting Theodore Roosevelt, a rather good thing. This was the aftermath of the death of Hennessy, a nightmarish 5 months for the Italians as the city expressed its fear and hatred of the racial class, and ultimately resulted in a lynching and 11 murders, and everybody who was involved in the lynching got off scot-free, and they all patted themselves on the back, lit some cigars, as Washington called it, a rather good thing. You know, I've read this section of Gary's book about 4 times as I first went through and just read the whole thing, and then going back to digest important sections that I think needed to be included in this podcast series. This specific section, it's insanity that on a level that I can't understand. A type of group fear driven by racism, by ignorance, by some need to, vent fear and hatred on people. And I read this multiple times, and every time I read it, I was like, it can't be that way. It just seems so insane. And yet, to the people of New Orleans, or at least the white classes in New Orleans, it was perfect sanity. It was the only reasonable thing to do in a situation that was completely unreasonable to them. And even as I look at it that way, I still can't understand it. Still can't understand the actions. And yet, it's what happened. And it's the state of what happened. And I can only, and again, I keep saying I can only imagine. I can't imagine what it would have been like to be an Italian living in New Orleans during the 5-6 months following the arrest, the prosecutions, the dragnet, the case, the trial, and then the lynching. And then what it would have felt like to be in the city, being an Italian walking around in the weeks and days and months following the lynching, as people that you know, personally know, slapped themselves on the back and said, "Great job," and then went to your Italian market and bought some food from you. It's just, I just had to talk about it a little bit, because even as I'm talking about it, I still can't wrap my head around it. And oftentimes, history is more insane and more unreal than what you see in television and movies. And I know we all know lynchings happened in the United States, and particularly targets were black people. And I'm not trying to at all in any way diminish the impact of that. I just didn't have any examples of that so far in my book. But everybody calling it a rather good thing just really disturbed me. That even as they are all thinking about what's right for God and the health of their souls, to call group murder a rather good thing. But this was what was a good thing to them, what told everybody in New Orleans that the Young Men's Democratic Association was what was right for New Orleans, was willing to do what it took to fix corruption, and it gave the group power and a license to do what they're about to do next. Before we get to the next thing the YMDA will do in New Orleans, I think we need to go back to our friend Thomas Anderson from the end of the first episode in this series. Thomas Anderson, in the intervening years from the murder of his friend, had tried his hand at a number of businesses to varying degrees of success. He was a boxing manager, a horse racing entrepreneur, saloon and restaurant owner, and a proprietor of a small but growing oil business. He wasn't born a wealthy person. He wasn't part of that white elite group. He was born and had grown up in a rough and poor Irish neighborhood in the city. He'd learned as a kid the importance of making friends quickly, learned the value of reciprocity, and making friends with making friends with people in positions of power that will help him get along and return a favor later on when he needs one. And he wasn't fussy about who he made friends with either. He didn't look down his nose at anybody. He wasn't a snooty guy, happily courting friendships with beat cops, as well as brothel owners, and doing favors for both. He'd earned himself a reputation as somebody who hustled, who was genuinely a well-liked person by everybody except his ex-wife. Thomas Anderson had one child from his first marriage, and that had ended when his wife died of typhoid fever. He gave his daughter over to a convent school in a nearby town while he continued on with his life and a second, none too happy second marriage. And that ended with a bitter divorce within his first year. During the 1880s, he had learned an important lesson working with a state-sponsored lotto business. And he learned that a business could make a massive amount of money as long as it gave a tiny annual sum to a charity and greased the palms of the right people in government would keep the lotto business profits rolling in. As long as you paid off the right people on city council, you could make a lot of money. Thomas Anderson wasn't the owner of the business. He worked in kind of the accounting area, but he could see how that lotto business operated and started to understand how the city itself ran. And as he managed to scrape together enough money, he soon opened his own restaurant/bar, and it quickly became a place known as neutral ground where legitimate and not so legitimate groups of New Orleans could meet and hammer out agreements in discreet rooms, while also receiving Anderson's becoming legendary hospitality. Anderson made friends everywhere, and they all came to his establishment. And as I said, he made friends on both sides of the law. And those people often met together at his restaurant and spread more of that so-called corruption around. Anderson's hospitality grew to a legendary status with his annual Mardi Gras balls that he would hold that were in basically open contempt to the stuffy affairs of the elites of New Orleans. Anderson kept his Mardi Gras balls stocked with prostitutes available for use, and he wasn't ashamed to let everybody know it. During the same time, Anderson was developing a reputation as a kind of up-and-coming Teflon Don kind of guy. He had frequent charges brought against him, flouting the mayor's Sunday closing laws and other temperance movement laws. They never seemed to stick. Tom was always able to exploit his friendships with local governments, local judges, the local police, and he always seemed to slip away unscathed, much to the chagrin of people like the Young Men's Democratic Association. And it was also during this same time that Thomas Anderson would strike up a soon-to-be legendary friendship with a madam of a local brothel named Josie Lebrano. Josie, in the wake of the Italian atrocities, changed away her Italian name, Lebrano, and exchanged it for a more English-sounding name, Arlington, calling herself Josie Arlington after, I think, an Arlington hotel she had visited once. Step away from her Italian heritage. Josie, much like Thomas, was another hustler who worked hard to remain an independent woman of Italian heritage in a city that hated Italians. She had a reputation for culturing the same kind of friendships and reciprocity that made Thomas so successful, and that worked for her as well. Josie, by now, had begun to have a well-earned reputation as running one of the highest-class brothels in New Orleans. For an Italian orphan who grew up in one of the poorest areas of the city during an era of the police dragnets and lynchings, she was regularly subjected to abuse from her guardians, and she had managed to turn her life into a success and had a reputation and aura surrounding her and her brothel as the very best of New Orleans vice. Josie and Thomas's friendship soon looked to be mutually beneficial, with Josie agreeing to sell Thomas a stake in her brothel. In exchange, Thomas's restaurant was just around the corner from Josie's, and it became a traditional stopping-off place before people would continue on to Josie's establishment, with Thomas helping them along to get there. Thomas happily promoted Josie's brothel as the very best and highest class New Orleans could offer, and he even renamed his restaurant the Arlington to help firmly cement the relationship. By 1896, the Young Men's Democratic Association and its reform movements were in firm swing, and in the wake of the lynching, a new mayor was elected, and they pushed for more control and more isolation on the widespread vice districts. A newly elected alderman by the name of Sidney Story proposed a way, quoting Sidney Story, to protect the pure and noble womanhood of New Orleans from unwanted contamination. Sidney Story developed a plan to make prostitution illegal everywhere in the city except for a designated 18-block neighborhood that was already well known for its vice and sin. He believed this would draw the bordellos and bars and black dance halls away from the respectable areas of town and relegate them to an already crumbling neighborhood, and that in doing so, it would cause the least amount of harm to the quote-unquote decent sensibilities of New Orleans citizens. Alderman Story proposed a restricted district. That's what he called it. This quote-unquote restricted district would soon become known as Storyville, much to the alderman's annoyance. Storyville, before it was Storyville, was a predominantly mixed-race, working-class neighborhood with a single African-American church and with little political representation in the government and not enough to object politically. A second, smaller area uptown of Canal Street was also unofficially designated as one of these restricted districts, and that would become known as Black Storyville. That was more of a segregated, isolated, black-specific district. And it was an area already with predominantly entrenched black bordello houses. The Storyville Ordinance was passed in January 29th, 1897, with 1 year given for everybody in the affected areas to comply. Long before the ordinance was officially passed or the official district of the city announced, Thomas Anderson had managed to use his many friendships and his insider access to the city council to find out what the proposed borders of Storyville were going to be, and he purchased a place called the Fair Play Saloon. It was a large restaurant located on the corner of Basin Street and Custom House, right at the point where most of the visitors would be entering the soon-to-be restricted district, and he made plans to renovate it. His business partner that he shared this information with, Josie Arlington, also purchased a property on Basin Street just a few doors away from the Fair Play Saloon. Both of them, up until this moment, were operating in gray areas of the law, and at times on the entirely illegal side of the law, and both of them saw massive opportunity in legalized vice, being able to operate bordellos, bars, dance halls, etc., with the blessing of the local government. And as author Gary Christ points out, with enemies like this, who needs friends? Alderman Story and the recently elected Mayor Flower and the other YMDA reformers were happily patting each other on the back, telling themselves they'd done a good job as they celebrated bringing what they would think of as some semblance of order to that era of blood and degradation I was talking about in my last episode. Little did they realize what they were actually doing was handing to Josie and Tom the power and wealth of what will become one of the most notorious eras of New Orleans and will lead to the birth of jazz. While Alderman Story and Mayor Flower and the rest of the YMDA are patting themselves on the backs, drinking brandy and smoking cigars, telling each other we've done a great job, there's something else happening. As author Gary Christ put it, there's something else brewing in the city of New Orleans. In the two neighborhoods soon to be designated as Storyville and Black Storyville, a new sound is born sometime in the mid-1890s. Right around the same time as that Italian lynching, as the death of David Hennessey was happening, the sound was being heard in the various venues along South Rampart Street. Places like Dago Tony's, the Red Onion, Oddfellow Hall, and other so-called, quote-unquote, Negro dives. Black Storyville, on the other side of Canal Street, was experiencing the same sound. The music, it was unique, it was catchy, and while it found its birth in these locations, it soon spread and could be heard all over New Orleans, in parks, street corners, dance halls, beyond the confines of these two destitute black neighborhoods. And because the roots of jazz go to the very poorest of neighborhoods and the poorest and least educated of musicians, it's difficult to point at any one person and say with absolute certainty the sound started with them. But if you were to open up any book on the history of jazz, you will find the name Buddy Bolden amongst the names of the very first leaders of this musical innovation. While there are other black, mixed race, and even white musicians of that very early mid-1890s that may very well lay claim to saying we made the first jazz sound, no one can deny that Buddy made one of the most distinctive, if not the first, statement of the musical form that will become known as jazz. Some of the very earliest listeners to Buddy's music claimed, quoting the listeners, that boy could make a woman jump out of the window, and that he had a moan in his cornet that went all through you. Charles Joseph Buddy Bolden, and like many others in those first few generations of jazz musicians, grew up in a poor black neighborhood in New Orleans. He was the grandson of slaves born in 1877. The neighborhood he was born in was foul-smelling and next to a stagnant canal that had sewage dumped in it. Remember, the city of New Orleans is a smelly place with open sewage running everywhere. Well, it all rolled into the canal, and of course, downstream from the canal was where the very poorest neighborhoods were, and that's where one of the black neighborhoods was that Charles was born in. It was so unhealthy. By the time Buddy was 6, He'd lost his father, a sister, and his grandmother to various illnesses. And as his mother spent some time moving around with various family members, they eventually settled in a mixed race, low income, German-Irish laborer area neighborhood. Say that 5 times fast. The neighborhood Buddy grew up in, it was poor but cosmopolitan. Peddlers were on corners and in alleys, and they would often use music in the form of old tin horns or makeshift cigar box banjos and soapbox basses being used to draw in passerbys on the streets to stop and see their wares. This was happening all up and down the neighborhoods with little of these makeshift bands trying to compete to draw in the crowds so that the wares could be sold. And it was a cosmopolitan neighborhood. Latin and Caribbean songs could often be heard mixing with Italian, Irish, and African sounds, all competing for attention, along with the hymnals coming from African American churches in the same neighborhoods. One visitor to New Orleans described the various musical sounds of the city like a phenomenon like the aurora borealis. The sound of men playing would be so clear, but we wouldn't be sure where it was coming from. So we'd start trotting and start moving. It's this way, it's that way. Music could come to you at any time. So try to imagine a dirt road filled with peddlers selling goods. Could be food, could be clothes, could be whatever. And down at each corner near each of these peddlers is somebody or maybe a small group of people singing, playing with these makeshift cigar box banjos or old tin horns, trying to draw people. And the ones playing the most catchy tunes are going to be drawing the crowds. This is what the area is like, and just competing with all these different cultural sounds. When Buddy was 16, around 1894, his mother let him take cornet lessons from a neighbor. Buddy, it turned out, was a fast learner, and in short order, he was soon working with established brass bands, playing picnics, parades, funerals, or any other social affair that called for a brass band. In spite of, or perhaps because of, his lack of formal training, Buddy had a tendency to play loose from the rules of traditional band music, and by 1897, he'd earned himself a reputation of having a unique sound. Fans of that bolden sound would describe his playing as hot, wide open, low down, and ratty. Somehow both bluesy and folksy, and it made you want to dance. Buddy also made up for his lack of being able to read music and formal training with a phenomenal ear for music. Legends say he could hear a band play a tune once and then go off on his own to practice, and within a couple of hours be able to play the sound by heart. Taking as much inspiration from the rag bands trying to draw people to their stalls as from the church music and the brass bands playing more traditional sounds. Buddy was not ashamed to take it all in, mash all of it together, and create something unique and catchy. Buddy soon had his own band called the Bolden Band, and he was one of the first innovators of the improvised jazz solo. Quoting a musician talking about Buddy, with all those notes he'd throw in and out of nowhere, you'd never heard anything like it, describing a jazz solo by Buddy. Buddy was not a man unique to his own sound or to the sound of jazz. As I said, there's no way to point to any one person and say definitively that's the first jazz player. And all along, at the same time, Buddy is creating his own unique sound. Many other musicians who are all growing up, living in and working in these same neighborhoods with the same bands, were all starting to gain reputations of their own as leaders in this new musical innovation. Jazz musicians like Freddie Keppard, Bunk Johnson, George Bayet, Pops Foster, and even a young Creole pianist known as Jelly Roll Morton were all exploring this new music and taking it in their own unique directions. And if that name, Jelly Roll Morton, is ringing a bell to you, and you are one of the listeners of this show who've seen the recent AMC TV series Interview with the Vampire, you may have noticed the piano player in the first few episodes of season 1. That is Jelly Roll Morton. Because of its roots in this informal musical smorgasbord happening in these poor neighborhoods, it's hard to point to any one thing or any one person and say, right here is where jazz started. You can trace its heritage to Africans, to Caribbean, to French, to Spanish roots, to ragtime bands, the blues tradition, and even various religious music. It seems, at least from my perspective, I'm not a jazz historian, of course, I'm just a fan of history, but it seems from my perspective, from what I've read, is that this seems to have been something to spring out of and be created by largely self-taught musicians, learning and innovating as they went and taking influences from everything around them. Famous jazz guitarist Danny Barker was born in 1909 in New Orleans. Right around the Storyville era. He died in 1994, and he once said of jazz, quoting Danny Barker, "Who cared if you read music? You were free to take liberties, free to express yourself from deep inside. The public was clamoring for it." End quote. Bolden's new loud sound was full of energy, and it didn't hurt his chances with the ladies, apparently, either. It only enhanced his legendary good looks, and it was said of Bolden's fans that women would fight one another to hold his hat or his coat. Not quite the screaming Beatles fans that would come in 60 years, but you can see roots of that Beatlemania in maybe this Bolden mania. The music that was born out of this mixed race and the black neighborhoods wasn't all sunshine and roses. It would soon run afoul of our friends in the government, the white elites, the Protestants of the temperance movement, and the YMDA, and the police would soon routinely show up to what these jazz musicians, these early innovative jazz musicians, would call tuning contests. This is kind of a early form of a battle of bands type things where two competing jazz bands would kind of go to a park and they would riff off each other. Would gather crowds around, and the police would come and they would literally beat people to disperse the crowds. The Protestant reformers of New Orleans considered the music a sinful affront to notions of restraint, temperance, and civil order. As author Gary Chris puts it, quoting Gary, this new black music represented excess, licentiousness, a direct flouting of traditional moral values, and perhaps most perniciously, it promoted contact. Much of it of the scandalous type, crossed the color line, and in a context of social equality that was simply intolerable to most Southern whites. End quote. And I think we shouldn't just leave that on its own and move on, because this is one of the most important things that we're talking about when we have to talk about the birth of jazz, of how this is a push and pull between the Protestant white elites, the Southern whites. It's racial, it's also religious, it's also cultural. There's so many things tied up into this, but when this music is playing, it's promoting equality. People are gathering together, mixing. There's no separation. It promotes contact. It's sinful, according to these people. But for everybody else, it's just good music. Even before Bolden came about in his sound, the white elites of the city were already rallying against this early jazz sound still forming. In 1890, before Bolden is making his statement, the Mascot, one of those papers that I quoted in my last episode and earlier, was rallying against black bands playing in one of the city's more notorious venues, and quoting the paper, "Here male and female, black and yellow, and even white meet on terms of equality and abandon themselves to the extreme limit of obscenity and lasciviousness." End quote. Another paper, the Daily Picayune, was also saying of this new music, quoting that paper, "It was demoralizing and degrading, something wholly forced and unnatural," calling it the musical equivalent of racial mixing, and called for it to be suppressed at all costs. This music was also this calling of gathering people together. It wasn't its own thing. Well, I mean, it was its own thing, but there's the hatred for it is in response to the recent Jim Crow laws coming in place. And not directly, it's all interchanged with each other, but we need to talk a little bit about some of the racial changes that have happened in just 30 years. In the early 1870s, black citizens in Louisiana could vote, they could serve on juries, schools, there were desegregated schools, and interracial marriage was legal. And that's not to say that there wasn't still significant racial prejudice, but it's a stark contrast to the New Orleans of the 1890s, just 20 years later. As the Reconstruction era ends and the Louisiana government comes back in control of its own state legislation, they immediately removed many of the equal rights provisions that had been put in place following the Civil War. Even though on paper it's removed, the elites were reluctant to do much definitively about it so soon after the war, fearing a return to military interference in the government. And as late as 1884, one Carls Warner, a famous writer, reported of Louisiana, again, this is 1884, white and colored people mingled freely on Louisiana Day. The colored citizens took their full share of the parade and honors, their societies marched with the others, and the races mingled on the grounds and in in unconscious equality of privileges, end quote. So you can see, even though on paper it's gone, as late as 1884, there is still a definite mingling of races on, at the very least, in these major events. Mingling together in unconscious equality of privileges is what Carl Warner described it as. But if you remember in my last episode, we talked about those Protestant elites being able to get a lock on the local government in the late 1880s and into the early 1990s. The Young Men's Democratic Association, the YMDA, they were determined to see a return to segregation. And by the 1890s, they have enough power for a majority in the government to be able to pass into the Louisiana Legislation Act 111, which entrenched segregation for train cars in the state and ultimately set a precedent for what will become the first of several Jim Crow laws. And it was passed by 23-6 in the legislation. Over the next several years, other laws will be passed to suppress the status and freedom of the state's black population. Interracial marriage will be banned. Interracial competition between blacks and whites will become prohibited, most noticeably after one black boxer decisively defeated a white opponent in the ring. But even as Bolden's band and the rest of the era's first generation of jazz players were finding their feet, the world around them was slowly seeing the resurgence of white supremacy in the state. The sound itself that inherently seemed to draw races together in equality, to listen to its catchy sound, was a particular affront to the segregation at the heart of Jim Crow laws and the YMDA government. And as the 1880s come to a close and 1900 begins, as Storyville begins, the two Storyvilles are birthed into legal being in the city. The white elites of the city could only hope that that dastardly sound that would become known as jazz would also isolate itself within those same two vice districts. And much like the rest of the sin that they're hoping, it will disappear from their view and ears if we're talking about jazz. As the century clicks over to 1900 and the Jim Crow and racial segregation laws are beginning to firmly entrench themselves in the city, there's still yet another major event to unfold, just as earth-shattering as the Italian riots from just a few years earlier. Before the era of blood and degradation comes to a close, a young man by the name of Robert Charles makes his way into the city of sin, and he will soon come to challenge the city's white establishment in a much more overt act of defiance. And we will talk about Robert Charles in our next episode. That is it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, it would mean a lot to me if you would just take 5 seconds and whatever platform you're listening to this on, whether it's Spotify or Podbeam or Apple Podcasts, YouTube, whatever that is, give this episode a like. And that helps immensely expose my channel and my content to other fans of history just like you. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we will catch you again next month at the first of the month as we continue our series exploring the history of New Orleans. And this time we'll be getting deeper into the real history of Storyville, how jazz and bordellos work together, and how David Hennessey and other people like himself and Josie Arlington work together to help use jazz as a way to draw in crowds to the city, and how that helps jazz itself evolve and form, and of course the response of the city to what they thought was going to be a reduction in vice and sin, and instead the exact opposite happens. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I will catch you next month. Bye-bye.